I'm Ben C.
I'm Dr. V, the medical legal guys. Today we're going to be talking about cerebral palsy and how we work up these serious injury cases. And first of all, it's important to understand, why does cerebral palsy occur? And that is because of hypoxia. And Ben, do you want to describe what hypoxia is?
Hypoxia, he's talking about, that is a lack of oxygen that is flowing to the brain. Generally, it's called HIE.
Hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And encephalopathy simply means that the brain is not functioning properly. And there's various forms of encephalopathy.
When it comes to babies, let's talk about babies.
Babies, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy is a form of neonatal encephalopathy. Neonatal is newborn. So when babies are born and they have a lack of oxygen during the birthing process, they could suffer a brain injury. And sometimes those brain injuries are reversible because the baby is delivered and they're resuscitated and the baby is fine. Other times they have suffered hypoxic brain damage.
When a baby suffers from a lower oxygen level in the brain than is normal or that they should have, right? It can cause harm if it's for a lengthy period of time or even a shorter period of time if it's a major drop in the level of oxygen. Hypoxia meaning lower oxygen levels. Okay, so that's one of the causes of cerebral palsy. Dr. B, tell everybody what cerebral palsy is.
Well, I first want to talk about how a baby presents at birth.
Sure.
And these babies, when they are born, they're blue, their electrolytes or their oxygen level is way off. Primarily the pH and the oxygen level is what is important. And are they acidotic? That means that the body is not getting rid of its waste. So these babies are born limp. They require intensive care treatment, and they're often taken to the ICU for management. If a baby has hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and it's severe or moderate, they are then treated with therapeutic cooling, where they bring the body temperature down. And that is the only way to protect the brain. And then they're in the ICU for quite some time after.
All right. That sounds pretty basic and pretty simple. Is that the way it happens in every case? Let's talk about cerebral palsy. What is cerebral?
Well, cerebral palsy is basically a brain injury. Okay. And it's a hypoxic brain injury related to the birthing process. And there are mainly 4 types of cerebral palsy. There's spastic diplegia. These kids generally have problems with walking coordination, and it's more of a motor problem. Then you have hemiplegic cerebral palsy, where they look like they've had a stroke, and they basically did have a stroke. Generally, the MRIs will show a problem in the side opposite of their weakness. Then there is kind of a athetoid cerebral palsy, where these kids have incoordination and they're kind of always moving. But those are really the main types of cerebral palsy. And spastic cerebral palsy means that the muscles just don't relax. Okay. And other kids, they can't get out of a wheelchair because of the cerebral palsy. It affects all 4 extremities. And these kids are often, very, very tight, and they need treatment to loosen them up so they could sit comfortably, so they could be placed in a wheelchair, and they need baclofen pumps, Botox, rhizotomies, and really lifelong care. So these are serious injuries. And what is interesting about cerebral palsy is that when you do MRIs on these kids' brain, 85% of the time they show problems in certain locations of the brain, but 15% of kids with cerebral palsy have normal MRIs, and the damage just doesn't show up. So they tend to be less severe, but they still meet the clinical diagnosis of cerebral palsy. The most important thing about this is that there are children who have hypoxic brain injuries. They have complicated deliveries. They're born hypoxic. they develop developmental delay. They have problems in school. They might have problems with coordination, but they're not getting diagnosed as cerebral palsy. So we know that these kids are injured, but it's hard. It was hard to prove it. Okay.
Yeah.
And now children with complicated deliveries with developmental delay, even autism now, when you get MRI DTIs, it lights up in the same area of the brain as the kids with cerebral palsy. So it's kind of a different presentation for a hypoxic brain damage. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there are children that had no recourse. The families had no recourse because it was difficult to prove that this brain damage caused their developmental delay or made their autism worse.
One of the types of cases that we handle and we work up are what I would call the acute birth trauma cases. Those are the cerebral palsy cases. Those are the cases where you've got hypoxic events that lead to lower oxygen, leads to brain damage in these kids, and leads to all these things that are offshoots of and form cerebral palsy. But it almost always comes down to a lack of oxygen, a lowering of that oxygen, either in the length of time that there's oxygenation levels that have gone down, or the depths of that lowered oxygen level. Complete loss of oxygen, for instance. It may not be for long, but it's long enough to give the brain damage. People come to us, parents of these babies come to us, and then children after years of seeking some help. And well, how did this happen? With this new technology, doctors and the lawyers are able to take that new technology and use it, because now, let me explain something called causation, right? So let's say that there was negligence in the birth, labor and delivery, loss of oxygen, all that stuff. And then you have a baby with cerebral palsy. One of the things we have to do is that we have to prove that first there was lack of oxygen. Secondly, that lack of oxygen is what caused the cerebral palsy. And so now we can do that in more cases because the studies are more significant in their detail, right? Does every case mean that there was a lack of oxygen at birth? Maybe not necessarily. Does every cerebral palsy case lead to the conclusion that the doctors or the hospitals or the nurses during the labor and delivery were negligent? No, not always. But it is a situation where if a child has cerebral palsy and if there was a complicated delivery, these things can be studied.
Pediatricians historically, when taking care of a child, aren't meeting their goals, in terms of ability to roll, ability to suck on a bottle, ability to sit up. Pediatricians have always traditionally had a wait and see kind of attitude, well, let's just see how things go. Okay. And now with these diagnostic studies, you could find the babies who are at most risk of not meeting their goals. If you have a baby who had a complicated delivery and is not meeting their goals, these children need a diagnosis so that it gets them into the treatment they need. And this wait and see attitude, that was last decade and the decades before. And the reason why is, I'm seeing this right now. We had a case and the birth history was terrible. Okay. The care was bad. And this was in Connecticut. They don't have a statute of limitations that protects babies there. You have to file the case within 3 years. The wait and see attitude, I got the call at age 4. There's nothing that we can do as lawyers if the law doesn't protect a baby. So you want to talk about statute of limitations for kids?
Statute of limitations being a time period after which you can't sue. Okay. Most states, even Texas, has a statute of limitations for minors that go much farther than just age 3. So some states go to 14. Some states go to age 12. Some states go all the way to 18, right? And so many states, 2 years after age 18, so that baby, now an adult, is 20 years old, then a lawsuit can be brought, right? All the states are different. So it's important that with respect to the statute of limitations, that be evaluated so that every lawyer wants to make sure that statute of limitations is followed.
So we're not waiting for diagnoses of cerebral palsy if a child has the global developmental delay, that is a criteria for us to investigate. And now hypoxic brain damage in children with autism, you can find those children who have hypoxic brain damage, and those kids in studies perform much worse than the kids with autism. That there's a subgroup of autistic kids who have been exposed to hypoxic brain damage, and they fall off the charts in terms of performance. Those are the kids who require 24-hour care to their life expectancy. If they have a complicated delivery, those are cases that we are investigating. So I'd like to kind of describe how our law firms evaluate a case. And every case that comes into my firm, I take the first call to kind of understand how the baby is functioning. Okay. And to understand, is this a serious injury? From there, the mother or the father will be directed to our staff, OBGYN, to be able to take the birth history, the prenatal care history, to understand the events as the parents experienced it, to see if the events suggest negligence and if the events suggest hypoxic brain damage. And if it meets our criteria on the phone, that's when we are executing contracts and getting the medical records, and we're getting the fetal strips, and then our OBGYN is reviewing, was there a negligent delivery? Our clients are talking to experts from the start.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how sometimes talk to folks who have been looking for an answer, right? This is a very obviously traumatic event in their lives, their whole family's life, right? And it's really difficult sometimes when folks who are just reaching out trying to find answers. I don't even think they necessarily care about litigation answers, but we get calls from folks who just want answers. And sometimes that turns into litigation. Sometimes it turns into a lawsuit. But what I have seen is that kind of almost a sigh of relief when we're able to have folks like that on staff who will look at the records and talk to the family and put things together so that we can usually give the family an answer and tell them what we think and what our thoughts are on what has happened and the cause of what has happened. And sometimes some cases are harder than others to get to those answers, but generally we get an answer, and the families do give that sigh of relief when they're happy to hear even some bad news, but they're happy to hear that news because it's an answer.